It's a very counterintuitive idea, but in a way, there's nothing more social than my sense of myself as an individual. Um, that um, self evidency, that my feeling so at home in language as the person who it communicates and is seen by other people, that is so apparent and naturally um, uh, evidently myself to me. Um, so I exist only in this medium of communication, mutual social recognition. This is a funny, so a big theme of Frankenstein is adoption. Um, the you know Creating a human being, but adopting um, uh, a kind of orphan of technology, um, and the creature, and then there are a number of other examples of adoption. Um, so that is a theme that explores the extent to which our um, social roles are dependent on some kind of intrinsic identity, or whether our family roles are uh, a matter of kind of generic social roles. Um, so that it's what it means to be in a family is not about essential qualities of the individuals involved, but about the performative roles, performative family roles. Um, so this is pretty amazing. This is an example of what's called brood parasitism. So this duck is tricking the owl into weaning it, raising it, and that it's freeloading uh, this owl's nest. So that's to say, these completely different species are, able to confuse themselves for kin, for parent and child. Um, uh, and so um, this is related sort of to behaviorism, the idea that what we are a function of how we behave. Our identities are a function of our actions in the world rather than the other way around. It's not that we have an essential internal identity and then our behavior expresses that. It's that we are immensely social creatures, or essentially social creatures. We take our essence from our uh, social behavior and interaction. Um, so here's an example. Uh, is sort of illustrating what I'm talking about. This neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky is talking about the correlation between um, brain size and social complexity. Um, so our brains are, we have the kind of brains that we do because of our social organization. Um, so he explains it better than I can.
Just asking you, Robert, why do we have brains?
Why do we have brains? Um, Probably to more effectively strategize at how to cheat at social contracts. I mean, single cell bacteria do all sorts of cooperative things and honest things and dishonest things when they can get away with it, but they can't do it extremely well. I suspect the nervous system not only makes you a whole lot more responsive to changes in environment, but it certainly makes for a lot more complexity in your social interactions.
So the brain is biologically and evolutionarily necessary in order to manage the life that is complicated, or does it help create that complicated life?
Yes, both. And immediately self-reinforcing in terms of the sort of by the time you get to the point of brains inventing things like culture, then you've got brain culture coevolution and each affecting the other. But it certainly gives one a whole lot more flexibility in one's behavior than you find in brainless single cell organisms.
So how do you compare the human brain with brains of primates, non-human primates that you have studied? What makes human brain so singular and stand out?
Well, at the end of the day, it may not be so singular, it may not stand out all that much. When you look for actual regions or cell types in the brain that are unique to humans, just not there. There's fusiform face recognition area, which was once thought to be only in humans. It's in other primates, a bunch of other species. There's these things called von Economo neurons, which for a while appeared to be the only neuron type specific to human. Now it's in elephants, it's in whales, it's in other primates. So the thing that makes the human brain sure is not that we've invented anything new. I mean, we use the exact same neurotransmitter biosynthetic pathways as a shrimp does or something. The big difference is numbers. It's just like our neurons do the exact same thing as a fruit fly's, and you put them under a microscope and they look the same and they smell the same and they taste the same or who knows what. And the only difference is that we have 100 million for every one that a fruit fly does. And I think the thing that makes human brains what they are is just sheer number of component parts and emergent properties that come from that.
So can you expand on it? Why do we have enlarged brains compared to other animals?
Well, I mean, one thing, but that immediately gets into a which came first sort of thing, is we're pretty pitiful compared to an awful lot of other species when it comes to surviving in terms of physical strength, things of that sort. So there was a lot of pressure on brains. But what's clear when you look across all the primate species, selection for brain expansion has not been because predators get smarter or prey get tougher to find, or it's for social complexity. Remarkable finding, a guy named Ian Dunbar at Oxford has shown across about 150 primate species, the single best predictor of the relative size of the cortex and of the frontal cortex is how big the average social group is in that species. In other words, our brains have evolved for gossip and backstabbing and hierarchy and keeping track of who's messing around with who, and it's been enormous evolutionary pressure for just mastering social complexity.
This goes very much against the view that we are created in God's image, no?
Yeah.
So this takes the claim that we're about our social essence, that we're essentially social creatures, to a much more radical level. We that we are, like pack animals. We are, what distinguishes us humans is not technological capacity, innovation, but sheer social integration, coordination. They we gossip, backstabbing. Our capacity to cheat at social contracts. This incredibly intricate social bonding. The way in which we're up in each other's heads, like unavoidably, involuntarily, like when you're walking down the street and somebody's walking toward you, and you do this little dance where you're kind of like, I'm trapped. Can't get out of it. I can't decide which to go left or right. Um, uh, that um, level of social entwinement um, is what has allowed us to succeed um, uh, as a species. Um, and it has a lot to do with literature. That's what art, music, um, and literature um, uh, mediate. Um, you know, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but when I've talked about the role of music in evolution, and one prominent theory is that music, first of all, that language derived from music, and then music derived from grooming. That as a means of social bonding, grooming each other's bodies, something that we could do in small tribal units, but once our brains started growing, and we started growing into larger kinds of social units, with the kind of birth of civilization, moving into more kinds of city-like social forms of organization. Music didn't no longer allowed for personal grooming. It was music that took the place of that bodily mediation, intimate bodily mediation of social bonds. And that's a fascinating way to think about music, is like attuning bodies, coordinating bodies in a really deep way, emotionally, physically. And I think literature is another extension of that. I mean, and one way in which I've heard gossip described is as a kind of moral grooming. We pick apart each other's behavior, hypocrisies, um, um, we pick apart, dwell on just arbitrary details of each other's behavior as a kind of social coordination, a coordination of feeling and judgment and attitude. And what are novels but gossip about imaginary people? Imaginary lives, imaginary details of accidental details of lives that we allow us a kind of emotional and judgmental coordination of social and moral judgment. Um, so this is all leading up to the the question of social bonding in Frankenstein. In particular, I want to look at the birth scene of the monster. We already noticed in Thel, in William Blake's book of Thel, he talks about this and sort of negotiation of self and other in our negotiation with the baby, the infant, the speechless infant child. That question I was raising before about like who we are before we speak. We gain our identity through how we articulate ourselves in language. So who are we before we speak? As an infant, the infans, the one without speech. And this question of recognizing the smile, recognizing an expressive behavior, a communication, so fascinating, looking at the baby's face, and like when distinguishing an expressive gesture from the arbitrary movements. If who we are is, a function of social interaction, um, I think what, Blake is asking us to think about, and, when the infant smile or the voice of a dove, what we hear is expressive. That's that's halfway to it actually being expressive. So, in other words, if there's nothing essential about us as individuals, there's nothing essential about um, uh, an individual communication. Communication is a social accomplishment, interactive. So that's to say, I don't think there's anything. I think what Blake is asking us to think about, and as we'll see, Mary Shelley as well, there's nothing essential about a smile. It's not as if the smile is either objectively there or it isn't. It's a social collaboration, it's a social accomplishment to accomplish that smile. Um, so if you think about it from the baby's perspective, it's, just kind of bobbing around. It isn't yet even individuated, um, has no sense of itself as an individual, but it's looking for responsiveness from the environment. And the smile, that, random, maybe more or less random gesture on the face is what elicits a response from the parents, and then that becomes a feedback loop of mutual recognition. So the smile, even, the first gesture is not even an individual expression so much as a social collaboration. Okay, so this is all just to introduce uh, the birth of the creature in Frankenstein, and I want to bring all these issues into it because I think it's so. On the one hand, it's such a familiar scene. I think we have to do a little work to kind of clear our minds of all this iconography around Frankenstein and the creature, and what this moment of birth looks like, and to be able to really read Mary Shelley's text the way she wrote it. And because the way she wrote it is, I think, very subtle and careful. Um, uh, in its depiction of this ambiguity, this uncertainty about what we see. We're getting Frankenstein's perspective on this, and so he's clearly horrified. He has his interpretation that the creature is horrific, but that's not objective. So I I um, I want to look at it with a little more open eyes and see maybe how this might be, rather than a horrifying spectacle, this might be uh, the a scene of Frankenstein's resistance to that social collaboration. He um, uh, may, in other words, be, resistant to the idea of the creature's birth. Full stop. That he's horrified not by the creatures, anything actually horrifying about the creature, but just the otherness of the creature. That the creature has a perspective of its own and is looking back at him. And this is related, I think, to the theme of patriarchy um, that we'll be exploring, that resists the otherness of women, of children, struggles to see women and children otherwise than as just reflections of the patriarch. So here is how Frankenstein describes the birth to Walton. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? So he's already front-loading his infinite care. So, it's almost, he is as if he needs to defend his resentment by emphasizing in advance how much care he put into him. And Victor proceeds to elaborate on the creature's beauty, or intended beauty, really, almost as if underscoring how much pains he put into the creature. He emphasized how beautiful he's supposed to be. And I think there's a patriarchal, or at least patronizing aspect to celebrating the beauty of, children in general. That it's sort of like celebrating the beauty of pets, and this it's expressing a kind of ownership, proprietary relation to the child. It's like, you're a doll for me, kind of, or it can be, praising the beauty of children. And that analogy of pets is made by Victor himself, talking about how much he loved his adopted sister. He said she was like a favorite animal. So that so again, Shelley is underscoring this kind of patriarchal, own proprietary attitude towards the family. So the creature betrays the intended beauty. And this also makes, I think, the reading this scene uncanny, and in a way that the typical or the iconic representation of Frankenstein's monster in the movie, he's ugly from the beginning, and so it lacks the kind of weird or uncanny effect, like, oh, it's supposed to be beautiful, but it's actually horrifying. That weird liminal status. It makes it confusing for the reader to imagine the creature supposed to be beautiful, but it's actually horrifying. The image I always have is of kind of a Barbie doll, like somebody trapped inside a Barbie doll. It's supposed to be beautiful, but it's somebody else's idea of beauty. There's a amazingly horrifying movie called The Skin I Live In, by the Spanish director Pedro Almodovar. That comes to mind. It is very much a Frankenstein story. So his limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. So the words that strike me as most crucial here is horrid contrast. That what's going on here is a betrayal or inversion of the not the intended creature, what Victor expected, has been replaced by the contrast. It's defined by the contrast. It's a horror that is the contrast to beauty. And it makes me think, one way to think about beauty is that it's certainly true that beauty is an aesthetic judgment. So it's not an objective property. It's an expression of a subjective reaction. So when I say the sunset or somebody is beautiful, I'm not reporting anything objective about them so much as I'm reporting on how they make me feel. That saying something's beautiful is telling you something about me, how that the beautiful thing makes me feel. And one way of thinking about that is has to do with distance. Like for something to be beautiful, it's about my holding it at the appropriate distance. If it were at a different distance, it would lose that effect. And maybe invert to something horrid. Like, if you, if flower is beautiful at a certain distance, but if you get close enough, it turns grotesque, or horrifying, and in a way maybe particularly horrifying. In contrast to the beauty. So, anyways, I think that's a good way of thinking about what's happening here. Is the object that Victor had been holding at a certain distance and defining from a certain objective remove is obtruding his eyes and his attention. Now it's become interactive. He's coming up too close, and that's what's so horrifying. And so Victor flees. So in this initial scene, the creature's just opening his eyes, and being perceived just sort of as an object objectively by Victor, as a betrayal of the beauty Victor had intended him to exhibit. It back to him, reflect back to me the beauty that I want to see. It's a narcissistic, again, proprietary relationship. So on the next page, when we see the creature, actually reach out, this, that gesture of like maybe smiling, it's already predetermined that Victor's going to see everything as sort of a horrid contrast and inversion. And I'm not saying that Victor's wrong. I think what all I want to do is point out the possibility that we're getting things already prejudged from Victor's perspective, which is first and foremost horrified by the otherness of the creature. Just the fact that it's something other, anything other than the particular object, beautiful object that Victor had intended, and that is inevitable. And moreover, it's a part of every birth, right? Like that's the way it is in every birth. Every child is something other than what's intended. So this again is it's fantastical sci-fi, but it's also very much about um, so, universal experience, the fundamental experience of the procreation of the species. Um, so again, just notice how every word is kind of prejudicial that Victor uses to describe the monster, and how this scene could be just like we were looking at with the baby's first smile, just a scene of looking for recognition from a parent. Um, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes that they may be called, were fixed upon me. His jaws open, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. Um, so, what could be, the voice, like Blake says, the voice of the dove, the voice of the infant's uh, um, awaking voice, the infant's smile, is described instead as noise and this kind of mechanical movement, inexpressive, inarticulate uh, movement of the face. So, by underscoring the very subjective, prejudicial terms in which this scene is narrated by Victor, um, uh, Shelley is inviting us to, imagine the reality, a reality on the other side of Victor's skewed perspective, reality of the monster's body, this embodied uh, perspective that the narrative is excluding and persecuting. And I think this meme here is really kind of brilliant, because it nails, I think, the central concern of the novel that's already manifest right here, that people that the material reality, the face, this embodied perspective, the reality of this embodied character, that's defined only in the language of the master, and that is even named by the master, named for the one who excludes him. In the sort of defining gesture of patriarchy, the way the woman inherits the name of the man, the slave inherits the name of the master. So what I want to say is, Shelley is really making us, inviting us to imagine the stranger. This is so Shelley is in this line of romantic texts like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, all those Wordsworthian strangers that we discussed, those sublime strangers, this sublime embodied perspective that defies articulation in the text. But Shelley kind of takes it to a more radical step. She doesn't, she just gives us this monster in Victor's narrative. So Victor's not acknowledging how much he's excluding the way we see, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and Simon Lee or whatever, that the sort of the sublime unspeakability of the mariner's body or Simon Lee's body is signaled, is registered. Here it's hidden beneath the Victor's prejudicial framing. He from the beginning cast the creature as betraying him, as a monster that has betrayed his infinite care. So I want to say that Shelley's evoking this kind of sublime material, ineffable material presence. Like, it is an Ancient Mariner. The presence of this unnameable kind of an unknown material presence that's left in a compelling question mark for the reader. And so the fact that as this meme is referring to, the fact that we so often mistake the creature for Frankenstein, we call the creature Frankenstein. That's a symptom of our own resistance as readers to acknowledging the radical strangeness, the creature's radical strangeness. We, like Frankenstein, we kind of follow Frankenstein's lead in wanting to domesticate the creature.